Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Behind one of Canada's most iconic hockey arenas lies a disturbing truth. Maple Leaf Gardens, located in the heart of Toronto, was once considered the very soul of Canadian hockey. Opened in 1931, it was the proud home of the Toronto Maple Leafs for over 60 years. For generations, it hosted sold-out games, historic wins, and unforgettable moments that became part of the nation's cultural fabric. Fans came from all corners of the country to witness greatness on the ice, never suspecting that something far more sinister was happening just out of sight. While the arena stood as a symbol of national pride, it also concealed a long-standing scandal that would only come to light decades later. The allegations would emerge that shook the very foundation of trust in the institutional allegations involving abuse, silence, and systemic failure. At the heart of the controversy were individuals in positions of power who exploited that power in the most horrifying ways, leaving behind a trail of trauma and unanswered questions. This story is not just about what happened in the past. It's about how such abuses were allowed to continue unchecked for so long. It's about accountability, justice, and the courage of survivors who came forward against all odds. The truth behind Maple Leaf Gardens is painful, but it is one that must be told. Maple Leaf Gardens opened its doors in 1931 during the depths of the Great Depression. Built in just under 6 months, it was a remarkable achievement for its time. A bold and ambitious project led by Conn Smythe, who envisioned a permanent home for his hockey team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. The arena quickly became a symbol of resilience and optimism, a place where people could gather to escape the harsh realities of everyday life. With its iconic Art Deco design and massive seating capacity, it was one of the most advanced sports venues in North America. For over 60 years, Maple Leaf Gardens served as the heart and soul of Canadian hockey. It was where the Toronto Maple Leafs cemented their legacy, winning 11 Stanley Cups under its roof. Legends like Sillaps, Tim Horton, and Daryl Sittler laced up their skates on its ice, while generations of fans filled the stands, creating memories passed down from parent to child. The arena wasn't just a venue, it was a rite of passage for anyone who loved the game. Saturday night games became a tradition, a unifying ritual that brought Canadians together around a shared passion. Beyond hockey, Maple Leaf Gardens was a cultural landmark. It hosted everything from political rallies to concerts by the Beatles, Elvis Presley, and Frank Sinatra. The energy inside the arena transcended sport. It was electric, alive, deeply Canadian. For many, it was a place of joy, community, and pride. It stood as a monument to the country's deep connection to hockey and to each other, a place where the Canadian identity was, in many ways, celebrated and reinforced. In 1997, a quiet yet deeply unsettling story broke into the national spotlight with the arrest of Gordon Stuckless, former Maple Leaf Gardens employee. What seemed at first to be an isolated incident quickly unraveled into one of the most disturbing abuse scandals in Canadian sports history. Stuckless, who worked as an equipment manager and ticket taker during the 1970s and 1980s, was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault against minors, many of whom were young boys drawn to the arena by their love of hockey. The charges revealed that the abuse had taken place over more than a decade, often inside the very walls of Maple Leaf Gardens. Stuckless used his position to gain access to vulnerable children, offering them free tickets, memorabilia, or time near their hockey idols. These seemingly generous gestures were part of a calculated pattern that allowed him to groom and exploit young boys, most of whom came from low-income or unstable backgrounds. He targeted those who were unlikely to speak up and even less likely to be believed. What shocked the public even further was the emerging suggestion that Stuckless did not act alone and may not have acted unnoticed.
Allegations
began to surface, implicating other staff members and hinting at a broader culture of silence. Some former employees and victims claimed that warnings or complaints had been ignored or quietly dismissed. The suggestion that others may have turned a blind eye added a harrowing layer to the scandal. Not just one man's crimes, but a possible institutional failure to protect children in a place that was supposed to be safe.
Ow.
As more survivors came forward and new allegations surfaced, it became clear that the abuse had been widespread, persistent, and largely hidden from public view for decades. The arrest of Stuckless opened the floodgates not just for legal proceedings, but for a national reckoning with how such atrocities could occur in a place so revered, and how power, access, and silence allowed it to continue for so long. Asterisk in the wake of Gordon Stuckless's arrest, a number of brave individuals stepped forward to share their stories, many for the first time. Men who had carried the weight of silence for decades began to speak out, not only to seek justice, but to reclaim a part of their lives that had been stolen. Their testimonies painted a haunting picture of how trust was manipulated, innocence was exploited, and how the allure of Maple Leaf Gardenza, place they once idolized, was used against them. One of the most vocal survivors was Martin Cruz. He was the first to publicly attach his name to the accusations. Courageous act at a time when stigma and fear still silenced many. Cruz revealed that he had been abused by Stuckless as a young teen in the 1970s, after being offered free tickets and behind-the-scenes access to the gardens. What began as a dream opportunity turned into a nightmare of grooming, manipulation, and repeated abuse. His decision to speak publicly gave strength to others who had suffered in silence, and it exposed the deep emotional scars left behind. The stories that followed shared devastating common threads: boys who were isolated, flattered, given special attention, and then preyed upon. The perpetrators created a false sense of trust and dependence, slowly breaking down boundaries until the abuse began. Survivors described feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion, often blaming themselves or questioning whether anyone would believe them. Many lived with lifelong trauma, struggling with depression, addiction, or fractured relationships as a result of what happened during those formative years. When the testimonies reached the public, the reaction was swift and emotional. Media outlets across Canada covered the scandal in depth, and public opinion turned from shock to outrage. People were horrified not only by the abuse, but by the idea that it had remained hidden for so long in such a celebrated institution. The voices of survivors were finally being heard, but it came at an immense personal cost. Martin Cruz, after testifying and sharing his story widely, tragically took his own life in 1997, just days after learning that his abuser had received what many viewed as a lenient sentence. His death became a turning point in how the country viewed the case. It galvanized public empathy and highlighted the urgent need for support systems, stronger legal consequences, and institutional accountability. The courage following the arrest of Gordon Stuckless, the legal system began to unravel a case that would span decades and spark national outrage. Initially, Stuckless was charged with multiple counts of indecent assault involving boys he had targeted. During the 1970s and 1980s, while working at Maple Leaf Gardens, in court he pleaded guilty to several charges and was sentenced to just 2 years less a day in prison, a sentence that stunned and angered the public. Many felt it failed to reflect the gravity of the abuse or the number of lives damaged by his actions. The backlash was immediate. Survivors, advocacy groups, and the wider public criticized what they saw as a deeply lenient punishment. The sentence reignited debates about how the Canadian justice system handles sexual abuse cases, especially those involving children in positions of authority. For many, it wasn't just about Stuckless, it was about a system that seemed more focused on procedural efficiency than on justice for victims. The legal story didn't end there. In 2001, Stuckless was convicted of breaching his parole conditions by attending a school environment, leading to further legal scrutiny. Then, in 2013, new victims came forward with additional allegations, triggering fresh charges related to historical abuse. These cases ultimately led to his 2016 resentencing. This time, the court handed down a harsher penalty, 6.5 years in prison. Yet even this renewed effort at accountability left many feeling that full justice had not been served, particularly given the decades of harm and the number of victims involved. Other individuals were also implicated in the scandal, including a former teacher and another Gardens employee. While not all were successfully prosecuted, the allegations pointed to a broader pattern of abuse and a disturbing culture of silence. Police faced criticism for what many saw as delays in responding to victims' reports. Some survivors CL. As the full scope of the Maple Leaf Gardens scandal emerged, one of the most troubling questions lingered. How could this have happened for so long? In such a public institution without anyone stopping it, the answer pointed to a broader failure not just of one individual, but of an entire system that allowed abuse to flourish through inaction, silence, and willful ignorance. Within Maple Leaf Gardens management, there appeared to be a serious lack of oversight. Gordon Stuckless was not a high-ranking executive he worked behind the scenes as a ticket taker and equipment handler, but he had unusual access to both the facility and the young fans who idolized the place. He moved freely through areas most employees couldn't, and no one seemed to question the number of young boys he regularly brought into the building. For years, this behavior went unchecked. There were no formal child protection policies in place, no vetting processes, and seemingly no accountability for how staff interacted with minors. More disturbingly, some accounts suggest there were clear warning signs. Several victims later testified that they tried to report their abuse either directly or through subtle cues, but their concerns were ignored or brushed aside. Rumors and quiet conversations circulated among employees, but no meaningful action was taken. They're out of disbelief, fear of reputational damage, or a desire to protect the powerful brand of Maple Leaf Gardens and the Toronto Maple Leafs leadership, chose silence. This failure to act allowed Stuckless and potentially others to continue their abuse unchecked. Corporate figures and public leaders also played a role in maintaining the silence. At the time, the gardens were owned by Maple Leaf Gardens, Ltd., a powerful organization with deep ties to the city's political and business elite. While no senior executive was ever formally charged in connection with the abuse, questions linger about what they knew and when. Many saw the lack of internal accountability as in the years following the scandal, Maple Leaf Gardens became a space not only marked by history, but by trauma. After the Toronto Maple Leafs moved to the Air Canada Centre in 1999, the building stood largely unused, its future uncertain. For many, the once rivered arena had become a painful reminder of what had taken place behind closed doors. The question remained, what should be done with a building so deeply tied to both national pride and a dark legacy? In 2004, Maple Leaf Gardens was sold to LeBlanc Companies and Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University, with a shared vision for redevelopment. It was a major shift, aiming not to erase the past, but to reimagine the building's purpose. After years of planning and construction, the arena was transformed. The upper levels were converted into an athletic facility for the university, including a new rink named the Mattamy Athletic Center. Below, the main floor was turned into a modern Loblaws grocery store. This transformation was more than symbolic. The redesign preserved key architectural features, including the iconic marquee and portions of the original seating, but gave the space a new life centered on community, wellness, and accessibility. For many, this repurposing represented a way of reclaiming the space. It was not about forgetting the past, but about confronting it and allowing something new to grow in its place. Toronto Metropolitan University acknowledged the site's difficult history and included discussions of the abuse in their educational and cultural programming. While not everyone agreed on how the legacy should be handled, the Retha Maple Leaf Gardens scandal sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of the arena, deeply affected how Canadian society viewed sexual abuse, particularly in the context of sports and trusted institutions. For many, it shattered the illusion that such abuse was rare or confined to isolated individuals. Instead, it exposed a much broader problem: the vulnerability of youth in environments where power, reputation, and access often go unchecked. One of the most significant impacts was the way it changed public conversations around sexual abuse. Before this case, many survivors felt silenced by stigma or dismissed by institutions. But the bravery of the victims who came forward, especially Those like Martin Cruz, who publicly named himself, began to shift the narrative. Media coverage became more focused on survivor voices. Discussions once kept behind closed doors were suddenly happening in living rooms, classrooms, and legislative chambers across the country. The scandal forced Canadians to reckon with an uncomfortable reality that abuse could occur even in the most celebrated spaces, and that silence was often a form of complicity. In response, there was a growing demand for systemic change. Youth protection policies in sports organizations, schools, and community programs began to evolve. Background checks became more rigorous. Codes of conduct were introduced or updated to include clear rules around adult interactions with minors. Mandatory reporting laws gained more traction, and the idea of safe sport began to take root, aiming to create environments where young athletes could thrive without fear of exploitation, though not perfect. These reforms represented a meaningful shift from reactive to proactive approaches in child protection. In the aftermath of the Maple Leaf Gardens scandal, many survivors did more than share their painful stories. They became powerful advocates for change. Turning their trauma into action, they worked to ensure that what happened to them would not happen to others. Their advocacy became a driving force behind efforts to reform laws, transform sports culture, and expand support for abuse survivors across Canada. Some survivors, despite the emotional toll, chose to speak publicly, using their voices to raise awareness about the long-term impact of abuse. Martin Cruz, whose courage helped bring the case into the spotlight, became a symbol of that advocacy. His actions inspired others to come forward and demand justice, though his life ended in tragedy. His legacy continues to fuel the movement for survivor rights and institutional accountability. In the years that followed, a number of support groups and organizations began to form or gain greater visibility. Groups like the Canadian Centre for Child Protection and Little Warriors played a key role in pushing for child safety education, public awareness, and survivor services. Survivors also worked alongside legal and mental health professionals to develop peer support programs, trauma-informed therapy networks, and public campaigns that helped reduce the stigma around speaking out. At the legislative level, the scandal added urgency to reforms in how Canada deals with child sexual abuse. In Ontario and beyond, lawmakers reviewed statutes of limitations, making it easier for survivors to pursue civil cases even years after the abuse occurred. Courts began to take victim impact statements more seriously, and legal precedent shifted toward recognizing the lasting damage of childhood trauma. The public outrage over the lenient initial sentencing of Gordon Stuckless was a wake-up call, pushing politicians and judges to reassess how justice is served in such cases. Sports institutions also faced mounting pressure. National and provincial sports bodies introduced stricter screening for coaches, volunteers, and staff. Codes of conduct were updated and education programs around consent, grooming, and boundary setting were launched. The idea of safe sport became central to youth athletic programming, reinforcing the message that protecting children must come before protecting reputations. Survivors of the Maple Leaf Gardens abuse helped lay the foundation for this transformation. Their pain sparked progress. Through advocacy, testimony, and persistence, they reshaped the way Canada thinks about abuse, accountability, and healing. And while the path forward is far from complete, the reforms born from their courage continue to protect new generations of young athletes and help other survivors find their voice. The story of Maple Leaf Gardens is a painful reminder that even the most cherished places can hide deep and lasting harm. Behind the roar of the crowd and the glory of the game, countless young lives were quietly shattered. From the bravery of survivors like Martin Cruz to the public reckoning that followed, this scandal changed how Canadians view institutional responsibility, youth protection, and the importance of listening to those who speak out. We've looked at how the abuse was uncovered, the legal battles that followed, the silence that enabled it, the reforms that survivors fought so hard to bring about. But at the heart of it all is a simple truth. Justice and healing begin with believing survivors and refusing to turn away from uncomfortable realities. If this story moved you, please take a moment to support survivors in your community. By educating yourself, supporting child protection initiatives, or simply breaking the silence when something feels wrong, your voice matters. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And let us know in the comments, what do you think institutions should do to prevent this kind of abuse? Your thoughts and conversations can help keep this dialogue alive and help build a safer future for everyone.